Welcome to Josh's Worst Nightmare Oddcast, presented by Denver Horror Collective. I'm your host, author Josh Schlossberg, surveying the dark landscape of biological horror fiction. For this episode, we're being jabbed by Douglas Ford. Douglas Ford is the author of a best-selling novel from D&T Publishing, The Beasts of Visaria County, as well as The Reattachment, Little Lugosi, a love story, and the upcoming short novel, The Trick, due in 2023 from Madness Heart Press. His short stories have appeared in several anthologies and magazines, as well as 2 collections, Ape in the Ring and Other Stories of the Macabre and Uncanny, and most recently, The Infection Party and Other Stories of Dis-ease. His work has been described as disturbing, dripping with atmosphere, and claustrophobically frightening. He lives just off an interstate exit made famous by a Jack Ketchum story. Welcome to my nightmare, Doug.
Thank you. And I should mention, I'm playing host to a cold right now. So actually, this is perfect. You know,
I always try to get my guests on when they're sick, so that's actually my goal.
So
I did have a guest on. That could not be more perfect. Thank you for planning it that way. I did an episode on COVID, and I made sure to get somebody who actively was sick with COVID. So
that's funny.
Following in that tradition. So for folks who know or who don't, obviously on Josh's Worst Nightmare, I invite on horror authors to talk about an aspect of biological horror, which I very broadly define as living creatures and vital processes, somehow irrelevant to their writing. So this episode, we're going to talk about immunity. Now, the disclaimer is neither of us are medical professionals. We are horror authors. I do have some science writing background, but I am not trained to give medical advice. None of us are. And frankly, if you're getting medical advice from a podcast, you get what you deserve. So that's all I got to say about that. But before getting into the immunity topic, so something we have in common, actually ×2, which I didn't realize until now. So D&T Publishing both published our works. Mm-hmm. So my novella, Maline, was published by D&T Publishing, and your Beasts of Visaria, as well as Infection Party, right?
Yep, that's right. Yep.
And your new book is going to be coming out from Madness Heart Press, The Trick, in 2023. My novel, Charwood, will be coming out from Madness Heart Press in 2023.
Oh, great. And I have another title, more of a novelette near the end of the year, coming out from D&T as well. Awesome. The Dead Cats of Civilization. So that'll be on the distant horizon.
Well, you are very prolific, and that is a great thing to see. So good on you.
Oh, thanks.
So yeah, all right, let's get into the topic of immunity. So the reason I brought you on is because of the book, which I've yet to read, but I do plan to, and I say this to all my guests, and it's usually true. It's just I had been doing these weekly, and it's like literally impossible to read every single book. But The Infection Party and Other Stories of Dis-ease. So what made you want to write that?
Thank you for calling me prolific. I think I think the writers have been falling into 2 camps since the pandemic. Some of us just kind of, I don't want to say fell apart, but our output definitely slowed down. I don't think that was my case. I think I picked up a little bit.
Me too.
And I did a lot of writing during in the early stages of the pandemic, including a story called The Infection Party, which I wrote. It was originally in a D&T anthology of political horror stories. And I realized when this is my second collection, and these particular stories, subconsciously, I think a lot of them involved some kind of sickness. And I ended up, when I was organizing the collection, I realized that, intuitively, I felt like The Infection Party needed to start the collection. And it wasn't until I started to put the other stories in place, and some of the stories go all the way back to the early 2000s, that I realized that I had a theme, more or less. And the book is bookended with to pandemics. And the last story was pre-COVID. It was written in I think 2004 about an imaginary pandemic. And I'm especially interested in how people react to it. And in terms of infections, I think they, in some cases, of course, it becomes metaphoric. I'm interested in how people are, how ideas, for instance, can become infectious. And a little bit of the Burroughs idea, I guess, of the language as a virus interests me as a writer. So this thematically, loosely, disease is a connecting tissue of these stories.
Yeah, well, I love that. I mean, I'm somebody who was writing about pandemics, and I, both in journalism as well as fiction, years and years before. I mean, we knew they were coming. I mean, they were happening, and knew more were coming, and this won't be the last one. But so obviously, I do think that it's important to write about that. I mean, it fits perfectly into the horror world. Some traumatic event that's going on in the world with all of these repercussions is something that's obviously worthy of being written about. But I do think some of the most interesting aspects are equally interesting as what you said, that the metaphoric aspects of what other things can be seen as virus. I mean, humans can be seen as viruses on the planet as a really negative view, but one that can hold up to a certain degree. Like you said, language can be seen as that. You get an idea out there and quote infects. It can be in a good way. And of course, a lot of virus, bacteria, more, I would say bacteria and microbes are actually, vast majority are either positive or neutral. So it doesn't have to be always a negative thing, but as horror authors, we're going to lean in that direction, of course.
Yeah. And, the whole idea of body horror, of course, is, that's such a central idea. And thinking about I'm stealing this from the title of something from Time magazine or something, but the body is an ecosystem anyway. We are, how we define selfhood. We have to think about it in terms of all the organisms and bacteria and other things that occupy our body at the same time, share it with us. So that fascinates me as a writer very much.
Yeah. So do you worry about disease a lot, or are you somebody who's indifferent? Yeah.
I'm not quite a germaphobe, but I think about it a lot because, especially as you get older, you start to become more vulnerable to whatever's going around. And in my other life, I teach. I'm a college professor, so I'm constantly with students, and of course they're things are floating around. And but like I said, I'm not a germaphobe. I haven't gone off the deep end with it necessarily, but it's definitely something that preoccupies me at times, for sure.
I think I'm in a similar boat. I'm definitely not a germaphobe, but I am a term that I actually appropriated from some other thing. Virus conscious.
Yeah.
I saw that once. I used it in a novel. I wrote a novel. Some of my listeners might remember I wrote a novel that I never got published and probably never will be published. And it was basically inspired by the H1N1 pandemic, which people cared about for like literally 1 week and then didn't. And I actually thought for about 5 days that the world was ending. This was years ago in 2009, I believe it was. And I remember having a thought like, well, what if we humans are just here as transport mechanisms for viruses? Like, what if that's and that somehow gave me comfort in a weird way. And so I wrote a book about basically a cult, a religious order that worships viruses as gods and would contract it and spread it to get up in the thing. And I use this term virus conscious. They called one another, if you were, I guess, saved, you were VC, virus conscious. And I took that term from, I remember seeing in some personal ads somewhere, somebody saying, the expectations of the partner to be virus conscious, which was probably like, do you have STDs, STIs, and whatever? And that just stuck in my head. So I just thought that was worth mentioning. No one will ever read that novel because it won't be published.
It's a cool idea though. And it's kind of, there's a kind of a sort of a similar idea that runs through two of the stories of the Infection Party, the two stories bookending the collection, which is that sharing a virus connects us, and it connects us to something beatific or something numinous and something that is larger than ourselves. And I don't define it quite as a deity or anything, but it's that sense that we have to share the virus, and it's good to pass it along. And to me, that's horrifying, because I don't want a virus, but there's a certain inevitability to it that my characters often, confront. So I like that idea, though, that it's the virus is the deity. That's really cool.
Just accepting that, and I mean, the evolution of things in our body do come from microbes or whatever. So it's really not that far off. I had it in a basically like panic-driven fever dream, but it's just like, you know what, that's as accurate as any theory. But so in your book, you mentioned something about chickenpox parties. So back to the immunity thing. So obviously, we'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, people know what chickenpox parties are, but maybe just lay that down, what that is.
And you mentioned the H1N1. I think during that period, flu parties were becoming apparently becoming popular. And some of this is apocryphal, whether or not this was actually happening. It's kind of like the infection parties that were allegedly happening in the early days of the pandemic. There were reports of them were sneaking into sources like the New York Times, but we later debunked and said this is really an urban legend. This is folklore, which in itself is a kind of infection too, where we have these. Yeah. And I was fascinated by that, just the idea that people would gather with the intention of getting, and you mentioned the pox parties. People do that to get chicken pox originally as a way of, resisting the vaccine, which, medical professionals will recommend you get the vaccine. But the party was considered an alternative to that if you get your kids together, get the chicken pox at a young age, then everything will be great. But then that doesn't count for, the rare instances of children who have some kind of awful reaction to it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, because when I was a kid, I mean, we're probably similar age. I don't think there was a chickenpox vaccine. Like, you did just
there wasn't.
So that idea back then was less an anti-vaccine thing and more just like, let's get it now, I guess. And like, I had a heavier case, not real bad, and then my sister had a lighter case. I remember that. I don't think we intentionally got it, but yeah, it's an interesting concept though.
It is. And it's a horrifying concept when you think about it compared to something like COVID, which was, we're still in a pandemic, of course. Yeah. It's still dangerous if you're not vaccinated. But when I was reading about that, that's what sort of created the seed for the story called The Infection Party. And it was inspired by a case where I think her name was Corson Lee Davis or something like that. And apparently, according to sources, she got COVID-19 because her mother took her to a party of teenagers, and where somebody was apparently infected. Corson apparently had some kind of other health problems. She died. And what to me was fascinating was in the coroner's report, there's reference to how do they put it? It was I have to look through my notes because I saved it. It was a release party, a release party. And I don't know what it's called, a release party. What were you releasing? Is it the idea that you're releasing the virus, or what was behind that? But that was more or less a direct inspiration for that particular story that I wrote.
Well, that's really interesting. And yeah, I don't want to go too deep into COVID stuff. People who watch my stuff know I do not like COVID. I think people should be taking it more seriously. I'm not here to preach or anything like that. But at least with chickenpox, that is immunity that can last and often does last your whole life. The problem they're finding, of course, with COVID is, natural immunity doesn't, I mean, it helps a little bit, it seems as if, for severe illness and death potentially, but then there's people get reinfections and over again. And there's, I don't know how many times people can do that. And then there's also different variants. And of course, the vaccines do prevent the severe illness and hospitalizations. Doesn't seem to be great at preventing the infection. So the immunity concept with something like chickenpox versus COVID, it's like different. It's a different kind of thing.
Right.
So it's tricky, and that's the biology and whatever. But something with the misinformation stuff, but also like the immunity concept of not biological reality. So immunity can be seen as what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That concept, which can be sound psychologically, but also repeated trauma doesn't necessarily always make you stronger too, but sometimes it does. So any thoughts on that? Not your psychological, not your opinion as a therapist, but just how that might tie into fiction storytelling.
Well, horror fiction in general is a kind of inoculation, if you think about it, or horror in general, because if to paraphrase Wes Craven, he said, I think at one point he said, horror is a boot camp for the psyche. And it's the idea that if you ingest enough of it, if you consume enough of it, that somehow, life traumas, you're better able to withstand them. And, there's seeds of the elements of that idea and things like catharsis that, you have to, if you emote, as a response to art, for instance, in tragedy, you're practicing essential emotions that you need as a human being to deal with, crisis or catastrophe. So, horror is kind of the inoculation in a way. And I as somebody who not only writes it but teaches it, I kind of preach that idea a little bit.
As well, you should. I think that's right on. In 2020, I wrote an article called horror fiction as a vaccination against fear or something like that.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And so I think that idea has been around for a while, and I think it is sound. Obviously, some people don't respond well to stuff like that, and there's different sensitivities we have to different things. But I do think that, well, like we tell kids all sorts of monster stories, right? I mean, all of the Billy Goat's Gruff. I mean, somebody gets horribly killed in almost every one of those stories. And
right.
Are we scarring children psychologically like that? Maybe, but at the same time, they're going to be dealing with shit in life. So at least have a Billy Goat killed, and then start to just accept that we do live in a dark world.
Right. And I've told this story before in different contexts, but I dedicated my first collection to my parents because they used to scare the shit out of me, and intentionally. They used to, when I was a little kid, they'd let me stay up all night and watch scary movies. And I remember vividly, because I'm a certain age, I watched The Son of Frankenstein on a creature feature or something at 11 o'clock at night. And then they'd let me walk down a dark hallway to my room at the end of the hallway by myself. And they'd hide in the other rooms and jump out at me. And I mean, when I told that story at KillerCon, during a panel at KillerCon. And I told my parents how I shared that story, and they said, they're going to think we're terrible people. And I said, no, that was great. That really that was practice for, the terrors of life that we confront. And that's what those of us who write this kind of fiction, I think that's kind of, we were all scared of the dark hallway, so to speak, and needed to practice responses to it.
Yeah, I think I write stuff like I'm afraid of certain things that other people aren't, and then a lot of the things that people are afraid of, I'm not in the least bit afraid. Like I go out in the wilderness alone by myself all the time, like in the middle of winter. I don't think anything of that. I don't worry about like getting beat up places or anything like that. As a guy, I guess that's an easier thing to not worry about. But I do think that the fiction I write and read, I'm not trying to make the world a more horrible place or disturb people. I'm trying to be like, look, through the darkness into the light. I mean, some of my stories don't end that way, but I still think it is just about, resistance training to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
It
what
is.
immunity is all about. How can we acknowledge that certain things are inevitable, and how can we, in a sense, toughen ourselves up little by little? That's what a vaccine is, right? You get a little bit
Mm-hmm.
of
A
the
little bit.
virus or protein or whatever it may be. It's a sound thing. I mean, little kids, babies particularly, they're always sticking things in their mouth. That's thought to be because they have no gut genome, and they're bringing bacteria and microbes into them because they have to. That's a positive thing. And there's even studies that show that kids who lived in a really antiseptic environment when they're young, I'm not talking about catching infectious viruses, I'm talking about, no dirt or dust anywhere, they're more likely to have asthma later on because their immunity never gets boosted. And I just want to make, again, the disclaimer. There's a lot of people that think, therefore, kids should just get every infectious disease all the time and that will make them stronger. Well, that's not often the case.
Right.
Reinfections of certain things are actually not a positive thing, but most stuff is not harmful. Dirt, stuff like that, it's might make us actually stronger. You put that stuff into our systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, some people go the other way, and some people say, well, I don't want to get vaccinated. I just want to be exposed to all these different things. It'll make my system stronger. And of course, there's, some truth to that, to be exposed to things. But at the same time, that's not necessarily the healthiest, most wise way to go through life. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the jury's out on that, but it seems as if, you can get colds a bunch of times. I don't know if getting a cold a bunch of times really harms you over the long term. I also doesn't seem to help because there's so many different cold viruses out there.
Right. Well,
So
that's why we'll never get herd immunity to colds, is because there's too many of them, too many viruses involved to the common cold, which I've got a bunch of them right now. So I'm an authority on that.
good on you. Yeah, well, that's yeah, they need to propagate somehow, and we're doing the Lord's work of spreading those viruses. That's why they're there. And again, most of them are. That's the funny thing. So many of them are harmless, and ironically, so viruses in particular, bacteria, I guess too, whatever, they don't want to kill the host. It's actually a stupid method for them. So the best thing that they can do is actually just keep
Mm-hmm.
people spreading or whatever. So people get immune. The immunity concept, though, is, yeah, I mean, I don't want to go real far into the biological stuff that I don't even understand, but talking about the misinformation element, which I thought that was a really apt analogy. So I guess the question is, if misinformation, whether it's about disease or just about whatever, if that can be seen as a virus, is there a way to get an immunity? How can we make ourselves immune to misinformation? You're a college professor. You're a professor, so you should know.
Well, it doesn't work to be exposed to too much information as a way to vaccinate yourself from misinformation, for sure.
Yeah.
It's a scary world, where a post-truth world, I guess is how it's described, or post-fact. It to me, I've, when I was originally going through grad school for literature, I was, really kind of embracing postmodernism, and, the idea that it's a fluid reality, that there's really no set truth. And that's something, as I've gotten older, it's becoming more alarming to me, that we do need some set truths. We do need to agree on some basic facts in order to function as, a society, as a democracy. And I live in Florida, where things seem more fluid here than ever, in terms of the things that we can agree upon.
Yeah.
So it becomes a scary world in that regard. And like you were pointing out, you're not necessarily somebody who's afraid. I think and I was about to agree with you. I don't think a lot of things scare me, but I think that does scare me.
Yes.
It's the lack of a consensus reality that we have.
That
You know,
scares me too. Yeah, no, I mean, certain things do scare me, but it's just not the normal things that scare me. But yeah, that is a frightening thing where people can just have totally different versions of reality. Now, of course, we don't really know what reality is, but we can at least say with a 99% accuracy that, okay, gravity seems to be working this way on the
right.
planet. Let's just call it good for now and not try to
Uh-huh.
pick this apart endlessly. It's kind of like you have to make decisions on certain things. And listen, I'm going to be open to the possibility of this, but for right now, I don't think that elves are real. Like, I would say that's closer to something that I'd be more likely to believe, that elves are real. But still, I'm gonna like, you know what? I'm gonna go about my life. They are real. Oh
I
wow.
wish they were.
Oh, well, then they may or may. I don't think they are. I'm gonna live my life as if they're not. If somebody wants to have some really compelling evidence, okay, I will, remain that little bit open to it. But yeah, I think it is really dangerous when no one can agree on stuff, whether they really believe it or not, or they're just being obstinate and contrarian. But yeah, the irony is being exposed to more idiocy doesn't really help. It actually can make
So,
you go down those rabbit holes. But at the same time, you don't want to not know. And my take is always understand the opposing views. So at the
right.
very least, you can have an argument against them. Don't
Absolutely.
shield yourself too much from it.
Absolutely. I mean, we need dialogue. We need argument. We need to have some good rational arguments. But to do that, you got to agree on some basis first, which
Yeah.
is, sometimes the problem is finding the common ground and figuring out what are the basic facts we can agree upon. I mean, at the same time, writing fiction, I'm fascinated by the way people can create fictions. I mean, a lot of my work, that's ultimately like the Beasts of Visaria County. There's a certain like a lack of, each character's kind of built their own sense of narrative out of the events of that book. And I'm fascinated by that process. I don't necessarily want to live in a world where everybody's creating their own fiction, but to me, it's an interesting process as a writer.
Yeah, well, I think fiction's a great place for that. And I mean, I write about people chopping people's heads off. I don't want that in the real world. But
No.
but yeah, as a fiction writer, I think that could be where we get a lot of inspiration too, right? From
Mhm.
silly ideas, maybe that we want to debunk or just play with. I don't always set out. I mean, I guess I am a little bit agenda driven in my fiction. I did write a piece a little while ago about should politics be in horror. I think it's impossible for us to take our politics, or more accurately, our values, out of our
Mhm.
fiction. But I do like to try to give, the wrong side not credence, but I like to play with it. I don't like to make things so black and white. I like to make it kind of gray. It's like, well, maybe this crazy person has a tiny point, and maybe this person who
Right.
thinks everything they say is righteous maybe has something off. So that's just fun in fiction.
Yeah, and of course, it's presumptuous to think that our worldview is the worldview,
Right.
and that's something that I think we all need to be cognizant of. So I can see that.
We never know for a fact, but at the same time, it's like if you're like, well, anything can mean anything, then you literally can't take a step during the day, right? We have to make decisions. I'm going to walk down this hall. Well, maybe this hallway is not the best hallway. Do hallways exist? That kind of thing. Then you could
Yep.
just, I mean, then you're just kind of huddling in the floor in the fetal position, going mad. So sometimes we gotta pick a lane, and I think it's like definitively pick a lane, but be open to that lane, changing that lane, but it's a hard thing to do.
It is a hard thing to do, and yeah, and I like your hallway metaphor because that brings me back to my story. There's always, hopefully your parents were hiding in a somewhere in that hallway to scare you, to make you a good horror writer or horror fiction reader today, or
And
movie viewer.
and maybe to make you a little bit immune to fear and the slings and arrows in life that are really inevitable. You got to go
Yeah.
through at some point. The coddling tends to make us weaker. At the same time, the latchkey kid who's abused, like that's no one's going to make an argument that that's good for them either. So finding that, what is that middle ground,
Right.
and who knows what that is, but at least we can play with that in our fiction.
Yeah, yeah. It's the pendulum, the latchkey kids now to the helicopter parents, and maybe the pendulum swings back.
Maybe,
So,
well, who the hell knows? Maybe the whole clock
who-
falls apart. It's
yeah,
impossible to say, but I
we'll
guess
all get sick and die, So
that's potentially the case. And if the virus gods want that, I mean, then so be their will, not much we can do. But it was really great to have you. Say where folks can find your work. I know we said stuff already, but maybe a website or where they can get a hold of you or whatever.
Find me on Facebook at Douglas Ford Writes, Instagram, and my work is available on Amazon. And anybody who'd like to, sign copies or anything like that can reach out to me directly through social media.
Great. Well, Doug, it was really great to have you in my nightmare.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for taking a trip with me through Josh's worst nightmare, where I, Josh Schlossberg, survey the dark landscape of biological horror fiction presented by Denver Horror Collective. If you don't want to miss any of the great, and sometimes disturbing, weekly episodes I've got planned for you, be sure to subscribe to Josh's Worst Nightmare on a variety of podcast platforms. You can also sign up for Josh's Worst Nightmare e-newsletter at joshsworstnightmare.com, where I share a whole squirming mess of bio-horror, including my infamous haiku horror reviews and my latest dark scribblings. Speaking of which, if you haven't already picked up a copy of my cosmic biological folk horror novella, Maline, from D&T Publishing, you can find a copy of the paperback, hardcover, or ebook at Amazon, godless.com, or joshsworstnightmare.com. Yours darkly, Josh Schlossberg.